Hello, it's October 16th, 2024. In this video, and probably the next, possibly a third, uh, will be titled, The Best Way That I Know How to Deal with a Difficult Situation. But one could replace difficult situation with times of stress, or even something like times of great emotional distress, such as, for example, times of great depression, or times of great unhappiness, or times of great ordeals. So the best way that I know how. And in this first one, I want to tell a story from my university days. Some of you may know that I studied mathematics, and this was when I was at Santa Barbara. So I was a math major at UCSB, and I was taking my upper division math courses. And I think it may have been my abstract algebra course. And there I was, just like any U.S. educated student. There I was sitting in class taking notes of the lecture. And I don't know, this might have been mid-semester, early semester, somewhere in there. And as I'm taking notes, I'm thinking to myself, Yuichi, your handwriting is terrible. This is going to be so hard to read later. And then when I thought about it, I realized I don't really spend a lot of time studying my notes. I mean, I look at them usually before an exam, but it's not like I go home and rewrite my notes or anything that studious. But then I had a thought that was a thought that I had never had. So the previous thought I just shared was a fairly common thought because it was clear to see my handwriting was terrible. But then I had a thought that I had never thought before, and that was this. It was, well, it was just a flash of a thought, and here I'm just elaborating that into a long thing. But it was more or less something like this. It was a moment of insight, basically, where I realized, oh, we're taking these notes so that we can have them as a resource later in case I forget something, or in case I need to remember something, or in case I want to go over something later, or prior to an exam, or prior to the final, or at some other point, I'll have it. Because if I hadn't been writing it, I wouldn't have something written down to go to. Certainly there's the textbook, and back then there wasn't YouTube or internet. At least no, I wasn't using the internet for resources. I think I was just doing email at the time. This was in the early 90s. I would go into a computer lab to type on a computer to send an email or something. But so, wow. Anyways, and I realized that was my intent. But the insight or the thought that I had was that as I'm taking these notes, as my hand is moving, jotting down what the teacher was saying and putting on the blackboard, it was a blackboard at the time, and that action that I was taking of taking notes was actually detrimental to my own. So in other words, the action that I was taking was sending a message to myself. And the message that it was sending was, Yuichi, you're not reliable. It was almost like sending this subconscious message to myself of, Yuichi, your mind is not reliable, so we're going to have to take notes. That was the thought I had. And it may have been true, or it may not have been true. But at that moment, it felt right to me that the act of taking notes was a way of almost condemning my mind, of saying, your mind is not good enough to remember all this when you'll need it later. And then the next thought was, it wasn't a thought, it was more like I thought it, which was, I wonder what it would be like to stop doing it. Would would that be like sending a more positive message to my mind, as if saying to my mind, Yuichi, I trust you. I trust you, or to the mind, I trust you, mind, that you're going to remember all this. And so as an experiment, I put my pen down and decided I would no longer take notes. And in fact, I don't believe I took notes after that again as an undergrad. But what I found was that when I put my pen down, what I was doing was I was removing the safety net of notes. And without the safety net, just like in almost every other domain of life that one could think of and that I can think of, when one removes the safety net, there's a certain level of, I don't want to call it fear, but I don't want to call it anxiety, but there's a certain level of a call to be a little bit more alert because there isn't the safety net. One has to be more engaged. And that's what I found myself doing was I was more attentive to what was happening. And not only that, whereas before, if I didn't quite understand something that the teacher was talking about, that the professor was talking about, I knew, oh, I have these notes and I can think about it later. And if worse comes to worse, I can go to the office and point to the notes. But now I didn't have that luxury. So now if there was something even tiny that I couldn't understand, I felt more compelled to raise my hand and ask the teacher, I don't really get it. Can you explain this? Which the teacher seemed to appreciate, or which professors in general seemed to appreciate the engagement. So I was more engaged in the classroom, in the lectures. And in some ways, I was taking more responsibility in the moment for learning. And there was no drop off in performance on exams or quizzes or anything. I don't know if there was an improvement. I mean, I was already, I, I don't think I ever got a letter grade that wasn't an A in my math courses. I got non-A's in some of the other courses, like film studies or whatever. But but in the math courses, it wasn't. So I don't know if I could have improved. But the interesting thing was, I wasn't. So it's that if someone were to look at me, and half the time I'm not a particularly visual person, so looking at the board didn't do much for me. I tended to listen. So half the time I would just be looking out the window, but really listening. And if something didn't sit right, I would raise my hand. But when I wasn't raising my hand, if someone looked at me, it would probably look like I was daydreaming looking out the window. But I wasn't. I was actually paying more attention than I was when I was taking notes. But so the reason why I'm sharing this story is that it taught me a lesson, and it points to a phenomena of sometimes we can have an intention behind an action, but the action may be producing an unintended consequence or be sending an unintended message to our own selves, right? In short, I saw that the act of taking notes was sending a message to myself of saying, Yuichi, you're not that smart. You're not that good at understanding and memorizing. And by the way, what I found out was that when I could really understand what was going on later during exams or when I'm doing homework, I could reconstruct the reasoning process. I wasn't good at memorizing things, but I was good at sort of understanding an argument. And a lot of math is about proof. It's about structuring an argument from A to B to C and so on. And so once I grasped and understood something, it was almost like I could just forget it. And a month or two later, if I had a problem, I could reconstruct the logical process of thinking to arrive at the solution. And so note-taking wasn't of value to me. So again, note-taking, the intent was, oh, it'll help me. But in fact, I believe, looking back, that it was creating a form of like lower self-esteem about my own intelligence. And only by removing the safety net of the note-taking and that implied message of Yuichi, you're incapable of just understanding it and retaining it for a long time, was I able to then understand and retain it for a long enough time to at least perform on the tests. And so that's the story I wanted to tell. And let's see, we're almost at 10 minutes. Again, the topic of these videos is best way to deal with difficult situations or difficult circumstances or difficult emotional states, difficult mental states. Okay.